Okay, so we all know who Dolly the sheep is, right? First animal ever to be cloned, media sensation, etc, etc. Except there's a lot more to this sheep than most people know. And there's also a lot that people think they know that's not true. For example, Dolly was not the first animal ever to be cloned. She wasn't even the first sheep to be cloned. So why is she the one that gets all the attention? Why aren't we talking about Megan and Morag, two of the sheep that were cloned before her? Well, that's because Dolly was the first sheep to be cloned using an adult cell. I'm going to explain this in more detail, but first I should probably include the disclaimer that I'm not a scientist or an expert or an academic. I'm literally just some random animal nerd with a podcast. So I'm not even going to try to get into too much detail as to the science side of the story, because I don't want to risk getting anything important wrong. Like, spreading scientific and medical misinformation online is not something that I ever want to be involved in. But I'm going to do my best to explain all of this in layman's terms from my own understanding. Of course, if you want a more in-depth discussion of the science behind all of this, then there are far better sources for you to get that information from. Really, I want this episode to focus mainly on Dolly as an individual anyway, since that's what this podcast generally is, telling the stories of animals as the unique individuals they are, but in Dolly's case, it's impossible to talk about her without getting at least a little into the science side of things. I mean, regardless, that was an incredibly boring tangent, and I'm sorry for subjecting you to that. TLDR, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm going to do my best, and I'm sorry in advance if I get anything wrong. But okay, let's talk about how Dolly came to be. Dolly was born at the Roslin Institute, which is a part of the University of Edinburgh despite the fact that it's located in Midlothian. And even though Dolly the sheep would become the thing they were best known for, arguably the only thing they're known for amongst the general population, the Institute didn't set out to clone animals for the sake of cloning them. Instead, they were looking into things like cloning and genetic modification for the purpose of developing medicines, trying to create and clone sheep with specific proteins in their milk that could then be used in treating illnesses. Or something along those lines. Again, this stuff mostly went right over my head when I was researching it. And I should probably include another disclaimer. I know, I'm sorry, feel free to skip it, but obviously animal testing and experiments are a very controversial topic, and for good reason. I'm not going to be getting into that in this episode, I'm not going to be sharing my own opinions, or passing judgment here. I just want to tell Dolly's story without preaching at you about my own thoughts on the matter. But yeah, I am well aware that a lot of people are going to have a lot of opinions, and that's entirely valid, but for the sake of this episode, I'm just going to keep the focus on Dolly herself. And the science that led to Dolly's creation and the things that we learnt from her have actually now allowed scientists to reduce the number of animals they use for testing and stuff, which, regardless of where you fall on the issue, is undoubtedly a good thing. But yeah, the cloning wasn't really the main part of what scientists at the Roslin Institute were doing. It was more a means to an end. But regardless of the reason, they were indeed creating cloned sheep. And cloning animals wasn't actually this super new concept. It had been happening since the 1980s, and various common lab animals, such as frogs and mice, had been successfully cloned. And even outside of the world of science, cloning in general was not new or even unnatural. I mean, it was in the animals it was being done with, but for some species, such as bacteria, that's just how they reproduce. There are also species of invertebrate, and even some vertebrates, that are capable of what's known as parthenogenic reproduction. Formerly known as asexual reproduction, parthenogenesis refers to when an egg develops into a fetus and then offspring without having ever been fertilised. The result is that these babies are essentially genetic clones of their mothers, because unlike with sexual reproduction, their DNA isn't being mixed with any other individuals. In fact, there's actually a species of lizard called the New Mexico whiptail, which is entirely female because they all reproduce parthenogenically, but that's a topic for a whole nother episode. My point is, cloning is a thing, and it's a thing that existed long before Dolly. But Dolly was absolutely the animal who brought scientific cloning to public awareness. And while it was well documented in scientific literature that cloning animals was possible, if you'd asked anyone prior to the creation of Dolly if she could have existed, they would still have said no. Experts in the field believed that it was simply impossible to create an animal from a cell taken from an adult. The reason for this is that when an egg is fertilised, it's just one cell. And then after fertilisation, that cell divides in two, and then those two cells divide in two, and so on and so forth, until they create an embryo, and then a fetus, and then eventually an entire baby. And as the fetus develops, those cells become more and more specialised to whatever part they're supposed to be creating. The cells that make up your eyes, for example, are completely different from the ones that make up your skin, or your liver, or your bones, or any other part of you, but they all originated from the same single egg cell. And the accepted belief at the time was that once a cell had become one of these more specialised cells, it couldn't go back. It only held the genetic information needed for its own specific purpose. So prior to this, cloning would be done with cells from an embryo that hadn't had time to develop yet. These cells would be cultured in a petri dish so there'd be enough of them, and then those would be implanted into an empty egg cell, which would be kept in a test tube until it was clear that it had properly implanted, and then it would be put into a surrogate mother who would carry the pregnancy despite not being genetically related to her child. I specifically promised that this episode wouldn't get too scientific. I'm so sorry. We'll get to the fun stuff soon, but this context is important. Basically, the only way you could create an entire animal was to take a cell that hadn't had the chance to really develop into anything yet. Or at least that's what everyone thought. But the scientists at the Roslin Institute decided to try and use some cells from fetuses instead of embryos. But they also, almost as an afterthought, decided to see if they could take cells from an adult animal too. So that's what they did. They took some cells from the mammary tissue, so the udder, of a 6-year-old ewe of the Finn Dorset breed. Those cells were then cultured in a lab before being fused with an empty eggshell. Basically, these were sheep eggs that had somehow, and I cannot begin to explain to you how, had their pre-existing genetic material removed. So the only genetic material they would contain was from this new cell that they were fused with. And this is why people thought it would be impossible to succeed in doing this with an adult cell. If you took a cell from a sheep's mammary gland, then the only genetic information that cell would contain would be the information needed to create a mammary cell, and not an entire new sheep. And this theory did seem to be backed by the initial results. All but one of these reconstructed eggs wouldn't develop, despite 29 of them being implanted into surrogate mothers. The initial part of this isn't really all that different from IVF, aside from the fact that they were basically emptying the eggs and putting a random cell in instead of just fertilising them like you usually would. And also that it was sheep and not humans. But broadly speaking, it has a lot in common with that. And like I said, of all the ewes who were implanted with these eggs, only one actually gave birth, and that happened on the 5th of July 1996. Even so, no one was 100% sure that it had worked until they saw the newborn lamb. After that, there really were no doubts. The sheep chosen to be surrogate mothers were from a breed known as the Scottish Blackface, or just the Blackface. These are apparently the most common breed of sheep here in the UK, and despite the name, they aren't actually Scottish. They actually originate from just over the border here in England. But what matters the most here is that the Blackface sheep have, as you might have guessed, black faces, as well as black legs, despite the fact that their wool is completely white. Some of them do have white markings on their faces and legs, which is adorable, but despite that, they all still have predominantly black faces and legs. But when this lamb was born, she was pure white from head to toe. She was clearly not a Scottish Blackface, and this was a very good sign, because the sheep whose mammary cells had been taken had been a Finn Dorset, a breed which is universally pure white. Now, of course, the lamb's outward appearance wasn't enough to confirm that she was the first mammal ever to be cloned from an adult cell. They had to do genetic testing to confirm it, and sure enough, the testing showed that this lamb had no genetic relationship to the sheep who'd given birth to her, and that she was indeed a clone from the ewe who'd had her cell taken. They'd done it! They'd proved that a single cell from an adult animal contained enough genetic material to create an entirely new animal from scratch. This disrupted everything the scientific field knew about cells. This was a massive deal, but staff at the Roslin Institute initially kept things under wraps, until their paper on the topic was ready to be published in the scientific journal Nature. It came out on the 22nd of February 1997, and was entitled Viable Offspring Derived from Fetal and Adult Mammalian Cells. Catchy! And, of course, this lamb was Dolly. If you're wondering, she was actually named after Dolly Parton, because she'd been created from the cells of a mammary gland, and one of the things Dolly Parton is best known for is, of course, her mammary glands. And apparently the human Dolly was fine with this. She said it was an honour that the sheep had been named after her, and that there was no such thing as bad publicity. And you can't even get angry at me for that pun, because for once, it's not mine! The second news of Dolly's creation and birth hit the headlines, it became a media frenzy that would later be dubbed Dolly Fever. She received worldwide attention, and reactions were mixed to say the least. Some were positive, awed by the science and the potential this kind of breakthrough had. Others were much more negative, condemning the whole process and wondering where man's newfound ability to play God would end. And some people just straight up didn't believe it. They thought that the whole thing was some kind of elaborate hoax. After all, it rewrote everything experts knew about cells and cloning. But later independent testing would confirm that Dolly was indeed the real deal. Journalists from across the globe flocked to the Roslin Institute to meet this marvel of science. And the Institute's phone was ringing off the hook. They received somewhere in the region of 3,000 phone calls in the first week alone. Sheep can be a very shy species, but fortunately for all involved, that was not the case with Dolly. She adored people and loved being the centre of attention, more than happy to pose for the camera and entertain her guests. And on the rare occasions when she wasn't so interested in playing to the crowd, reporters soon found that she could easily be lured over with food, which Dolly loved, but her caregivers less so, as it made it much harder for them to keep her at a healthy weight. Amongst the journalists and reporters were a newlywed couple, who wanted to have a photo taken with the sheep of the hour, and honestly, if your wedding photos don't have a famous farm animal in them, then was it really worth getting married? Like, this isn't even the first time on this podcast that I've covered a story where a famous farm animal was featured in people's wedding photos. That happened at least twice with Emily the cow too. And if you haven't listened to that episode yet, then you totally should. The public just couldn't get enough of Dolly the sheep, and she received offers to appear on at least one American talk show, although that didn't actually happen, as trying to transport a sheep across continents is probably not all that easy and certainly wouldn't have been in the best interests of Dolly's welfare. And the Americans weren't the only ones asking Dolly to travel either. When an IKEA was set to open relatively nearby, they apparently asked if Dolly could attend the opening clad in blue and yellow, and once again the answer was no. Apparently, the Institute even had multiple different astrologists calling up to ask about Dolly's exact date of birth so they could predict her future, I guess? I don't know, I'm not an astrology girly. But it wasn't all so light-hearted. Some of the phone calls the Institute received from members of the public were downright heartbreaking. People would call asking them if it would ever be possible to clone back to life loved ones who had passed away. Everything from pets to partners to children. And the thought of bereaved parents desperately hoping that they might be able to be reunited with their lost child is just... it's so upsetting. And the thing is, cloning in real life is very different to cloning in science fiction. The clone isn't the same being as the one they were cloned from. Genetically they're the same, yes, but they're still a separate entity. And even if they have the same genetic predispositions when it comes to things like personality and behaviour and quirks, a different upbringing and experiences would still mean that they wouldn't act in the exact same way. A cloned person would still be their own person, rather than a carbon copy of whoever they were cloned from. So cloning a loved one back to life wouldn't actually bring them back. It might create someone who looked the same, even acted similarly to a certain extent, but it wouldn't be the person you'd lost. And there's also, the whole ethical thing of cloning humans, which is why that's never actually happened, and probably never will. Cloning pets back to life, however, is now a thing you can do. Although it is ridiculously expensive, and for the reasons I've already mentioned, you're still not going to get the same animal that passed away. You'd probably be much better off for so many reasons to just adopt from your local shelter, but it is now a service that exists for those who can afford it, and that's all down to Dolly. Another group of people who were immediately very interested in Dolly's story were conservationists, who were curious to know if the technology that had created her could potentially be used to help save critically endangered species, or perhaps even bring back to life species that had already gone extinct. Cloning in conservation is a really interesting topic that I'm already planning to do a future episode on because I find it absolutely fascinating, and it's such a rabbit hole of nuance and ethics and science, and yeah, there's definitely going to be a full episode on that at some point in the future. It's way too complex to get into in this episode. Some scientists have even wondered if it could one day be possible to use this kind of cloning to bring back prehistoric species, like dinosaurs and mammoths and cave lions. Yes, a real-life Jurassic Park is something that people have looked into, but it's also something that is, realistically speaking, centuries off, if it's ever even going to happen at all. Sorry to burst your bubble if you're excited about that. But yeah, Dolly fever had a stranglehold on media across the world for a hot minute, and it also led to all kinds of discussions around the ethics of this kind of technology. In all of this frenzy, it's easy to lose sight of Dolly. Not Dolly the concept, Dolly the experiment, Dolly the moral dilemma, but Dolly the sheep. Dolly who had no idea she was such a phenomenon. Dolly who never asked to be the centre of the world's attention. So, let's talk about Dolly. Dolly lived at the Roslin Institute for her whole life. You might be imagining sterile labs and cages, but in reality, the sheep at the Institute were kept like any other sheep. They all lived together in a flock, with fields to exercise and graze in, and barns for shelter, and a team of experts caring for their every need. And to her herdmates, Dolly was just another one of them. They didn't see her as anything different or special. Of course, scientists closely monitored Dolly, keeping an eye on her health to see if there were any negative effects from the cloning. But aside from that, and the whole media attention thing, she lived a very normal, peaceful life. You guys will already know by now that when I talk about an individual animal on this show, I often like to include direct quotes from those who knew or loved them in life, because I think they're the best people to tell these stories. And luckily for me, on Dolly's 20th birthday, the University of Edinburgh compiled quotes and recollections from those who had known or otherwise been impacted by Dolly. And so I'd like to share a couple of those with you now, because I think it gives a really good image of who Dolly was as an individual. From Kirsty McGavin, quote, "As my dad was part of the Dolly team, I had the pleasure of visiting Dolly most weekends as part of my regular trips down to the farm. I remember Dolly as being the most gentle sheep, absolutely adoring all the attention that she received, and always being a fan of the camera." End quote. And from Leslie Paterson, quote, "She was a really pretty sheep. She was so pretty. The first time I went to see her, that's when it dawned on me, because she was in amongst all the other sheep, and then you realised just how photogenic she really is. She was also a character. She had so much attention when she was a baby lamb. Then, obviously, when they announced it, she had so much press. The first thing she'd do is walk up to the side of the pen and push everybody out of the way, because she knew that they were coming to see her. She really played to the attention. She'd stand up on the fence and put her 2 feet up, expecting a titbit. She was a pet without a doubt." End quote. If you want to read the rest of the memories shared about Dolly, then the link will be in the show notes along with the rest of my sources for this episode. Dolly's life was, for the most part, pretty much the same as all the other sheep at the farm, and part of that involved breeding. In April 1998, Dolly welcomed her first baby into the world, a single ewe lamb who was named Bonnie. Then the next year she gave birth to twins who were named Sally and Rosie, and the year after that she had triplets, who were given the names Lucy, Darcy and Cotton. All 6 of her lambs shared the same father, a Welsh mountain ram by the name of David. Not long after this, in the autumn of 2001, it was noticed by Dolly's caregivers that she had begun to walk a little stiffly, which was obviously a cause for concern, especially as she was only about 5 years old, still pretty young for a species that can live for a decade or more. Dolly was given x-rays, which led to her being diagnosed with arthritis, the exact cause of which was never fully established, although it was theorised that this could have been the result of her being cloned from adult cells, that it had basically caused her to age prematurely. However, Dolly was swiftly put on anti-inflammatories, and within a few months her symptoms cleared up, and she was back to living her best life. Although from what I can tell, I don't think she was bred again after this point. This might not seem like a big deal, but 3 years ago, in the January of 2000, a sheep named Cedric passed away at the farm. As he was one of their cloned sheep, it was very important to the team that they worked out what his cause of death was, which revealed that he had fallen victim to a disease called sheep pulmonary adenomatosis, or SPA. This is an incurable viral illness that causes tumours to grow inside the sheep's lungs. There's no cure, and being viral in nature, it can easily pass from sheep to sheep. So the fact that Dolly was seen coughing was an immediate red flag, and she was swiftly given a thorough exam by the team's vet, including blood tests, but nothing out of the ordinary was found. So on the 14th of February, Dolly was put under anaesthetic and given a CT scan. The scan revealed that Dolly also had SPA, and tumours were present in her lungs, which was the cause of the coughing. Since there's no treatment or cure for her condition, they made the decision to put her to sleep. Bringing her round from the anaesthetic would mean putting her through a slow, painful death, and that wouldn't have been fair on her. It's worth noting that there doesn't seem to be any evidence that Dolly and Cedric's passings were the result of them being cloned. SPA can affect all sheep, and an outbreak on a farm always leads to casualties. Even so, it must have been a real blow to the team who had known her all of her life. And of course, her passing led to her once again making headlines around the world. She was only 6 years old. After her death, the Roslin Institute decided to donate Dolly's body to National Museums Scotland, who oversaw the preservation of her remains, and she now stands proudly as a taxidermy mount in the National Museum of Scotland, where she's one of their most popular exhibits, which is saying a lot, as it's actually the most visited British museum outside of London. I know I said I wasn't going to get too scientific on you in this episode, but I do want to talk briefly about the legacy she left behind. Because the things that may one day be possible because of the technologies that created her are honestly incredible. I've already very briefly touched on the potential use of cloning in conservation, but like I said, that's something that's going to be its own episode one day. One thing I do want to talk about though, is the work spearheaded by Professor Shinya Yamanaka of Kyoto University. He's credited much of his career to Dolly, talking multiple times about how when he'd finished his training, he found himself feeling lost and unsure of what to do with himself, to the point of almost developing depression. But then Dolly's creation was announced in Nature, and reading about it immediately inspired him with the potential this new breakthrough could have in medicine. Again, I'm not a scientist or an expert by any stretch of the imagination, so I'm not going to go too in-depth with this for fear of getting it wrong. But basically, Professor Yamanaka was able to take what we learnt from creating Dolly to be able to create an entire new type of cell, and this basically allows, for example, human skin cells to be turned into any other kind of cell, like a heart or a brain cell. And this technology could one day be used to treat all kinds of different conditions, including ones that are currently incurable. Things like Parkinson's disease, diabetes, spinal cord injuries, cardiac failure, all by reprogramming cells. The potential this has to save lives is incredible, and while this sort of thing could be done before, that required basically creating human embryos to then destroy for their cells, which was obviously very involved and also very controversial from an ethical standpoint. And it had an increased risk of your body then rejecting the new cells being put into it. And one of the things that I think is most exciting about this kind of research is that they can now take skin cells and turn them into a sperm cell or an egg cell regardless of the sex of the animal they were taken from, which means you can create offspring who have two parents of the same sex. This has so far only been done in mice, but think what this could mean for humans if the technology ever gets there. For people who are infertile, for same-sex couples, for trans people, it's mind-blowing. Of course, there's still a lot of work that has to be done before we can get to that point, and there are plenty of ethical questions along the way that will need to be answered. But what science has learnt from Dolly the sheep could very well go on to save lives and allow people to become biological parents who otherwise might never get that chance, and I think that's honestly incredible. And thanks to Dolly, scientists have already been able to massively reduce the number of actual live animals needed in experiments. Hopefully one day we'll reach a point where animal testing of all kinds will be a thing of the past, and when we do, Dolly will be a big part of that. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. If you enjoyed it, then it would mean the world to me if you could support the show in any way that you can. Whether that's through subscribing so you never miss an episode, leaving us a positive review or rating if you're listening via a podcast app, or liking the video and leaving a comment if you're listening via YouTube, and of course sharing the show with your friends. I'm really sorry if I sound awful in this episode. I'm currently quite ill with some kind of virus, and I very nearly wasn't able to get an episode out this week at all because of not being well enough to record. And then I finally did manage to record it, only to realise afterwards that there'd been some kind of technical issue with the microphone, and it sounded awful. So I've now had to re-record the whole thing, and I probably sound horrific. I don't know how much you can tell, like how much my throat is hurting by this point from the sound of my voice, but it's not been easy. I'm not looking forward to editing this and having to spend like an hour just removing all of my coughs and sniffs and other horrible noises. So yeah, thanks for sticking with me, even in my very ill state. I really hope I don't sound too, like, gross in this episode. I'm really sorry if I do. Thank you, as ever, to everyone who's already gone out of their way to support the show. I really do appreciate it more than you know. New episodes of the Animal Nerd podcast come out every single Tuesday, except from when I'm too ill, plus bonus minisodes at least once a month, so why not stick around? After all, it's officially spooky season, and I can't wait to share our first ever Halloween specials with you. Trust me, you do not want to miss them. Thank you again for listening. I'm going to go back to curling up in the fetal position and crying, and until next time, stay wild, friends!